Hi, my name is Pat, and this is my channel, Book Chat with Pat, and I'm glad that you're here. A little more than a week ago or so, I saw a video by Olly at Criminali entitled 10 Books That Made Me. And in that video, Olly talked about 10 books that he read relatively early in his life, from childhood into his 20s, that basically shaped the reader that he would become. And then a few days later, I saw another version of that same topic from Brian at Bookish Texan. And Brian did his video of the 10 books that made him. And I told both of them that I wanted in on this and that I was going to be doing my version of the 10 books that shaped me, that have helped to make me into the reader that I am today. And these are all books that I encountered relatively early in my life. So I'm going to start with my childhood, and the first books that made a profound impression upon me and that I read voraciously. And that would be the Bobbsey Twin series. I have probably a dozen of the books from that series that I saved from my childhood, or probably that my mother saved. I just have a few to show. Here's the Bobbsey Twins, The Secret at the Seashore. The Bobbsey Twins and Their Camel Adventure. The Bobbsey Twins and the Secret of Candy Castle. I remember this one really vividly. The Bobbsey Twins and the Talking Fox Mystery. And the Bobbsey Twins and the Red, White, and Blue Mystery. I have a couple more of these, but those were the ones that I brought down to show. And I would say I was reading these when I was about 8, 9, 10 years old. Although they say that they're by Laura Lee Hope was not a real person. This series and the two series that I would read after that were all basically written by nameless writers writing for the Stratemeyer Company, and this group of writers put out the Bobbsey Twins, the Hardy Boys, and the Nancy Drew Mysteries. And there were some others too, but those were the ones that I read. These were mysteries, and I loved them. I loved trying to solve the mystery, and I loved the configuration of this family. This family, the Bobbsey Twins, were two sets of twins. There were 12-year-old twins, Bert and Nan, and 6-year-old twins, Flossie and Freddie. So each set of twins had a boy and a girl in it. And I loved that. Somehow I loved that there were these 4 siblings and 2 sets of twins and a boy version and a girl version of both ages. That somehow resonated with me and just made a lot of sense. And I loved being, in my imagination, a part of this family. After I exhausted the Bobbsey Twins, I actually next went on to the Hardy Boys by Frank W. Dixon, but also really by the Stratemeyer Company, because my brothers had the Hardy Boys. So they were available to me. They were readily available, and I read through all of their books. I don't have those. I don't know if my brother has them. I'm sure my mother would have saved those as well. I don't know where they are, but I have the Bobbsey Twins. And then from the Hardy Boys, I went on to Nancy Drew. And I don't have my Nancy Drew books. Maybe by then I was taking them out of the library. I'm not sure. But I think I had one floating around somewhere, but I can't put my finger on that. But In all of these series, I just became immersed. I had that wonderful experience of losing myself in the world of these kids. And they were all mysteries. So I developed an early interest in that genre. I've talked in other videos about the profound effect that Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird had on me. And I read this way before we were reading it in school. This is my mother's first edition from 1960. And I found this book on my parents' bookshelves, and I read it from their shelves when I was probably 9 years old. I remember, and I've told this story in other videos, watching the movie first because my oldest brother was reading the book in high school and he was required to watch the movie on TV, and it was on a Saturday or a Sunday night, and my whole family watched it together, and I fell in love with the story. I loved the story of Scout and Jem and Dill, the little kid next door, and Atticus Finch and his defense of the wrongly accused Tom Robinson. And so I saw this movie as a little kid with my parents and my brothers, and then I discovered that my parents had the book on their bookshelves, and I had to read this book, even though this is a book that is usually taught in late junior high school or early high school. I came home from school. I can still see myself, racing home from school, going into my father's den and curling up and reading this book. So it wasn't something I was reading for school. I didn't take it to school with me, but I read it at home, and I couldn't wait to get home to get immersed in that world. It would later be a book that I would read in high school, and it is a book that I read many times as a teacher because this is a book that we taught. But this book probably more than any told me that reading was going to be a huge part of my life. Next, a book that you're going to laugh. I talk about in every video that I can, J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. This is not my old version, which I found at a book sale, but this probably is, this may be the one that I don't know if this is the one that I read when I was 13 or not, but this is a pretty old one too. This is a book that a dear friend gave me when we were about 13, and she said, "You have to read this book." And I took it home, and I think I read it that day. I think I read it, through the afternoon and the evening. And I fell in love with the character of Holden Caulfield. I completely identified with him. Holden is a young teenager. He's just been thrown out of another prep school. He's very smart. He's a talented reader and writer, but he cannot focus in school. And the reason he can't focus in school is because his youngest brother, Olly, who was like his best friend, just someone that he adored, had recently died of leukemia. And Holden is, sent off to boarding school, and nobody is helping him deal with his severe depression. Holden is telling the story from a psychiatric hospital, which sometimes people don't realize when they start reading it. But finally, at the end of the adventures of the book, he is getting help. And so the whole story is, that he's telling, which is his life story, he's telling from a psychiatric hospital. He's talking to his therapist. And he can't abide by the terrible things that people do to other people in the world. He's disillusioned with a number of the adults in his life, many of whom he finds to be phony. But most of all, he's in deep mourning, and no one is helping him to cope with the losses, with the loss that he has suffered. His goal in the novel is not to not to do anything with the phony adults that he finds, but rather to protect children from the loss of their innocence. And he becomes focused on that with his little sister Phoebe in mind. What he wants to do more than anything is prevent them from being corrupted by growing up. And that's what this book is about. And as a 13-year-old, it spoke powerfully to me, and it has continued to. I've probably reread that book more than I've reread any book on the face of the earth. It's been that important in my life. The next 4 are a series of books that I encountered in high school. And these were books that told me that I was a serious reader and that I was going to major in English in college. And, somewhere along the reading of these, I also, and probably because of the teachers that I was reading them with, I also decided and figured out that I was going to become a high school English teacher as well. I've certainly talked in a number of videos about Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. This is probably the first British classic that I read, except maybe for Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, which I read when I was very young. But this is probably the first, long, serious British novel that I read and that I couldn't put down, that I, again, lost myself in. And I read this before I read any of the other Brontes, before I discovered Mary Shelley, before I discovered Jane Austen. This was the first. This copy is a copy that my department gave me as a gift, and I think I've shown this in other videos. But I had been given an award, a teaching award, and my department bought me, knowing how much I loved this book, they bought me this beautiful copy of it, and it's inscribed by my entire English department. So this very, very treasured copy of a very important book. When I was in the 10th grade, I was in an honors English class with a teacher that I absolutely adored. And she treated us as adults. She treated us as, grown-up readers. And she expected a lot from us. And there were two, and 10th grade English was American literature. There were 2 novels that she gave us to read. She gave them to us, on a Thursday or a Friday and said, read this over the weekend. It's due on Monday. Not long novels, but certainly American classics. One was Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. It's not the first Hemingway that I read. I think the first was The Old Man and the Sea, which I think we also read in that same course, but certainly the one that made a powerful impact on me. And then the second book that we were also told to read over a weekend was F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. And she just expected that we would have read them in their entirety and then come into school on Monday ready to talk about the whole novel. So we weren't doing a chapter by chapter slog through. And in both cases, I just remember going home, I remember where I was sitting. I remember reading The Sun Also Rises on my living room couch, starting on a Friday, late Friday afternoon, and reading it through the weekend. And, these were just books that told me that I was a reader, and and I wanted more. I wanted more of these authors. I wanted to study literature. I knew then that that I was going to major in English, and I would go on and read everything that F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote, and certainly everything, not everything. Every now and then I find something of Hemingway that I haven't read, but almost everything that Hemingway wrote. Stuff is always being discovered now and then, but I've certainly read all of the major novels. And as a very, very young teacher, I would also teach a Hemingway seminar. And I taught The Great Gatsby more times than I can count. And then in the following year, in 11th grade, again, with a very wonderful English teacher, I read Albert Camus' The Stranger. I read this, we had to do an independent reading, and I selected this because I had a copy of it, not this one. I had a paperback copy that I had picked up at a used book sale, and I had heard something about it, but I didn't really know anything about it, and I decided to read that for the independent reading. And I got so into it, and I wrote this essay on it, that later in the year, when it became necessary for us to pick an author to do an extensive research paper on, I picked Albert Camus. And I reread The Stranger, and then I read The Plague. I read his play Caligula, and I read The Myth of Sisyphus and other essays, and then read all kinds of literary criticism about Camus, and wrote this just massive research paper on the literature of the absurd, and it makes me laugh to think about it now. But I was very intense. I was very, very serious kid, very serious reader, and I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop reading and researching. And I've read many other things that I've studied with that kind of intensity after that. But that was the first time that I had ever, done extensive research on an author, and, had become, for a 16-year-old, a mini expert on the author's body of work. Okay. As a young college student, I think the summer between my freshman and sophomore years of college, I was working in a drugstore for my summer job, and I discovered John Irving's The World According to Garp on a book rack in the drugstore, and people were talking about this book. This is not the copy. This is a later copy that I bought, because I see it's got Robin Williams from the movie on the cover, and I read it before there was a movie. But this is a later copy, I guess, that I bought. But I read this book, and I read it on my lunch break, and I read it on my breaks, and I fell in love with John Irving's world, the world that he creates in his novels. And I would go on for the rest of my life to follow the works of John Irving. I'm almost a completist. There's something that I've missed somewhere along the line, but he's the guy that if he has a book out, including his most recent book, I mean, he's well into his 80s now. I bought his most recent novel as well, but I just love the world that he created, and it's a bizarre world. And this is what made me a reader of contemporary fiction. So he was probably the first author that I discovered, and I think I was 18. So then I went back and read his earlier books, because this was not his first novel, and then I think I've read everything that he's written. Everything that he's written since. And there are many other contemporary authors that I have discovered, obviously since John Irving, but I think he was the first. And also, just a little fun fact. I worked as a waitress all through graduate school at the Bread Loaf School of English. I was a waitress at the school while going through the graduate program. And John Irving showed up one day for lunch because he was meeting with Bob Pack, who was my mentor at Middlebury and a great poet and someone that I love dearly. I did a video on him recently because he passed away about a year ago. And John Irving showed up for lunch. He was having lunch with Bob Pack because Bob taught at the Bread Loaf School of English, and then when the School of English ended in August, he took over as the director of the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, and John Irving was going to be one of the writers at the Writers Conference, and he just dropped by one day. He lived then in New Hampshire, and he just dropped by in Vermont one day to have lunch with Bob Pack, and I was their waiter. I served lunch, and he was just a really, really nice guy. Okay, that's my little fun fact, my John Irving fun fact. Okay, that's number 8. Number 9, talking about reading contemporary fiction. I would soon discover Toni Morrison. And she remains one of my very favorite authors. I read Beloved first and then went back and read her earlier works and many, many works that she's written, that she wrote after Beloved. I've made, a video on Beloved and why it's considered a banned book, and I've talked about it in several videos. As I discovered her, another one, I read Tar Baby and Sula and The Bluest Eye, and Song of Solomon was another one that just, one of my favorites of hers. I think that discovering Toni Morrison back in the 80s, I think introduced me to the world of women's fiction. She was probably the first female author that I followed extensively, and also women and writers of color. I would go on from Toni Morrison to discover and read Zora Neale Hurston, Alice Walker, Maya Angelou, Audre Lorde, and on and on. But this was the first. This was the first. Toni Morrison was the first, and then the last writer that I'm going to talk about, and the last book that I'm going to talk about. And you'll notice I'm bringing more than one book for each of these authors, but it's 10 books that I'm actually listing. Next is Adrienne Rich, The Dream of a Common Language. Adrienne Rich is the first poet that I read seriously. I discovered her also in the 1980s. I think I have all of her poetry books. I've read all of her poetry. I've read most of her prose. So I would say she's the first poet that I have where I can call myself a completist, where I've, just read deeply over time, over more than 40 years. I had a powerful sense of identification with her. She is not only, an accomplished poet, but she's a feminist scholar of the first degree. I read a lot of her prose, which, also just opened up a new world. I mean, this was the first feminist scholar that I read. I would read many, many after her, but she was the first. And I think this might be the first book of her prose. This is selected prose, 1966 to 1978, on lies, secrets, and silence. Somewhere in the late 80s, when her Times Power had just come out, I went to hear her read. She was reading at a local university here in New Jersey. She was reading, doing a poetry in the round. It was a poetry in the round series in the 1980s at Seton Hall University. And this book, Times Power, had just come out. And, so of course she was selling the book at the reading, or they were selling the book, but I saved the program from the reading, and she was horribly crippled at that point. She suffered from arthritis from her early adulthood on, and she was very, very crippled. I remember she could barely even walk at that time, but I was able to get her to sign the program. But so she's someone that I've followed for my entire adult life. There are other poets whose work has resonated deeply with me, and that, probably maybe have become as important as Adrienne Rich, but she was the first. And set me on a path of reading contemporary. Well, I read all kinds of poetry, but she set me on a path of reading contemporary poetry. So that's my list of the 10 books that have made me the reader that I am today, and they're a good part of the person that I am today too. So this was a lot of fun to put this together, and I want to, this is not a tag video, but I'm certainly encouraging my friends to consider doing this. It's a really good good topic to think about. So, as always, I thank you for watching. I hope that you're doing well. I'll speak with you again soon. Take care.